Sometimes the people who love us the most are the first ones to stop believing in us. At 61, Gerald Mackenzie knew that feeling all too well when he walked away from everything and disappeared into the woods. His family thought he'd lost his mind, living under a tree like a man who'd given up. They laughed about it at Sunday dinners. But Gerald wasn't giving up. Beneath the roots of an ancient oak, he was building something with his own two hands. Month after month, he carved out a life his children had never seen. When they finally came to find him, they discovered something they never expected. What they found would change how they saw their father forever. But would they understand before it was too late? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Gerald Mackenzie's hands had built things all his life. Solid things. Tables that didn't wobble. Chairs that held weight without complaint. Cabinets with doors that hung true for decades. For 37 years, those hands had shaped wood in a small workshop on the edge of town, creating custom furniture that people passed down through generations. His name had meant something once. Quality, reliability, craftsmanship you could trust. Now those same hands gripped the steering wheel of his truck, knuckles white, as he drove deeper into the forest outside Millerton. Everything he owned fit in the bed: a tent, a sleeping bag, basic tools, 3 changes of clothes, and a leather-bound journal that held every business record, every sketch, every note from 4 decades of work. The journal sat on the passenger seat beside him, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. 61 years old, and this is where life had brought him. The workshop was gone. Sold to cover debts he'd accumulated trying to save a business that was already dying. The economy had shifted. People wanted cheap furniture from big-box stores, and his careful joinery couldn't compete with particle board and Allen wrenches. He'd taken out loans, made bad investments trying to modernize, partnered with a distributor who'd promised everything and delivered bankruptcy. 2 years of watching his life's work crumble, one unpaid invoice at a time. His children had watched too. Bryce, his oldest at 35, was a corporate lawyer in the city, all sharp suits and sharper words. When the business started failing, Bryce had offered advice Gerald couldn't follow. Cut your losses. Dad, pivot to something profitable, as if 3 decades of craftsmanship could be abandoned like a bad stock pick. Vanessa, 32, worked in marketing for a tech company. She tried to help by creating a website, setting up social media accounts, talking about brand identity in a way that made Gerald's head spin. When those efforts failed to save the sinking ship, she'd grown quiet, disappointed. Her calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Kevin, the youngest at 28, was pursuing his doctorate in literature. He'd always been the gentle one, the dreamer. He'd said the right things. "It's not your fault, Dad." But Gerald had seen the worry in his eyes, the fear that failure might be hereditary. Their mother would have known what to say to all of them. Sarah had died 8 years ago, cancer that came quick and mean, and Gerald still felt her absence like a missing limb. She'd been the one who understood that his work wasn't just about money. She'd run the business side while he built, and together they'd made something that mattered. After she died, he'd thrown himself into the workshop, trying to work through grief with chisel and sandpaper. Maybe that's when he'd stopped paying attention to the changing world around him. The children had their own lives by then, their own careers, their own problems. When everything fell apart, when Gerald finally admitted defeat and sold the workshop, they'd been sympathetic but distant, busy. He'd become another obligation. Another worry they didn't have time to handle properly. So he'd left them a letter. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just honest words about needing time away, needing space to figure out who he was, without the workshop, without the identity he'd worn for 4 decades. He'd told them not to worry, that he'd be fine, that he'd be in touch. Then he'd packed his truck and driven into the forest. The old logging road was barely passable, overgrown with brush and rutted from spring rains. Gerald drove slowly, carefully, until the road simply ended at a clearing. Beyond it, the forest stretched deep and quiet, pine and oak and maple rising like cathedral columns. He sat in the truck for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, wondering if he'd finally lost his mind, like his children probably suspected. But when he stepped out into that silence, something in his chest loosened for the first time in years. He spent the first week exploring, walking deeper into the woods each day, learning the terrain. There was a stream a quarter-mile east, cold and clear, a meadow to the south where deer grazed at dawn, and at the heart of it all, an ancient oak tree so massive it must have been growing since before this country had a name. The oak's roots twisted above ground, thick as a man's body, creating natural hollows and caves where they met the earth. Gerald stood beneath those branches and felt something he couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, or possibility. He set up his tent nearby and began the slow work of learning how to live in this place. How to start a fire without matches when the wood was damp. How to purify water from the stream. How to move quietly enough that the wildlife stopped seeing him as a threat. His body ached in new ways, sleeping on the ground, hauling water, gathering firewood, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. At night, by firelight, he'd open the leather journal and read through his old notes. Measurements for a dining table commissioned by the Hendersons in 1997. Sketches for a rocking chair that had taken him 3 months to perfect. Orders and invoices and careful records of every piece he'd ever built. His entire professional life documented in his own careful handwriting. Some nights he'd add new entries. Not business records, there was no business anymore, but observations about the forest, the way light filtered through leaves at different times of day, the pattern of bird calls that meant rain was coming, small sketches of interesting root formations or the grain patterns in fallen branches. He thought about his children often, wondered what they were saying about him at their Sunday dinners, if they gathered without him now. Probably they did. Probably Bryce made dry comments about Dad's midlife crisis, though at 61 it was hardly midlife. Probably Vanessa worried in that efficient way she had, making mental lists of things she should do to help, but never quite finding time for. Probably Kevin defended him, or tried to, with more kindness than understanding. The thought didn't anger him. He'd failed them in ways that mattered, not through lack of love. He'd loved them fiercely always, but through lack of presence. He'd been so busy building furniture for other families that he'd missed building something more important with his own. Sarah had tried to tell him gently in the last months of her life. "They need you, not just your work," she'd said. But he hadn't known how to be anything except a craftsman, a provider, a man who built solid things. 3 weeks into his forest exile, Gerald sat beneath the oak tree and made a decision. He could live in this tent through 1 more season, maybe 2 if he was lucky. Or he could do what he'd always done, build something that would last. He examined the hollow where the oak's massive roots met the earth. The space was substantial, protected from above by the tree's canopy, and from the sides by those ancient, twisted roots. With some work, some careful excavation and reinforcement, it could become something more than just a hollow. It could become a home. Gerald opened his journal to a fresh page and began to sketch. Not furniture this time. Something bigger. Something that would prove to himself, if no one else, that he wasn't a broken man hiding from the world. He was a craftsman, doing what craftsmen do, taking raw materials and transforming them into something useful, something beautiful, something that mattered. His pencil moved across the paper, lines becoming walls, spaces becoming rooms, possibility becoming plan. Outside, the forest sounds continued their eternal rhythm. Inside Gerald's chest, something that had been dormant for years began to wake. He had work to do. The hollow beneath the oak had been calling to Gerald for days before he finally answered. He'd walk past it each morning on his way to the stream, measuring it with his eyes, calculating possibilities. The entrance was nearly 6 feet high, where the roots arched overhead, and the space extended back into the earthen bank a good 12 feet. Nature had done half the work already, carving out a shelter that had probably housed animals for generations. On a cool morning in late September, Gerald stood at the entrance with his hand against the rough bark of a root thicker than his torso. The decision crystallized in that moment, not gradually, but all at once, like water becoming ice. He could survive here in his tent, scraping by, waiting for winter to drive him back to town in defeat. Or he could do what he'd been born to do. He could build. The voices came immediately, the ones that sounded like his children, but lived only in his head now. Bryce's voice sharp with legal precision. "This is insane. Dad, you're 61 years old, living in a hole in the ground like some kind of animal." Vanessa's voice, wrapped in concern that felt like judgment. "What are you trying to prove? That you've completely given up on normal life?" Kevin's voice, the gentlest, but somehow the hardest to bear. "Dad, please. Just come home." But home was gone. The workshop was someone else's now. The house he'd shared with Sarah had been sold to pay debts. His children's homes were places he visited awkwardly, sitting in living rooms that didn't need him, making conversation that felt rehearsed. This forest, this hollow beneath an ancient oak, this was the only place that felt like it might become something real. Gerald returned to his truck and retrieved his tools. The handsaw, its blade still sharp despite years of use. The chisel, set Sarah had given him on their 10th anniversary, each piece fitted into a wooden case he'd made himself. A measuring tape, a level, a square, the fundamental instruments of his trade. He'd sold most of his power tools to settle debts, but these he'd kept. A craftsman could do anything with hand tools and patience. He started by clearing the hollow, removing decades of accumulated debris, fallen leaves, animal nests, loose rocks. The work was slow, meditative. His back complained, muscles he hadn't used in years, protesting the unfamiliar movements. But his hands knew what to do, reading the space the way they'd read countless pieces of wood, understanding structure and possibility through touch. The root system was incredible. The oak's roots had grown in patterns that seemed almost intentional, creating natural archways and support beams. Gerald traced them with his fingers, feeling where they were solid, where they'd rotted, where they could bear weight. This tree had been growing for 100 years, maybe 200. Its roots had been solving engineering problems since before Gerald was born. He could work with this. By afternoon, he'd cleared enough space to see the full potential. The hollow extended further back than he'd thought, opening into a chamber where the roots formed a natural dome overhead. The earth was dry and packed hard, the tree's canopy keeping rain from penetrating. With proper drainage channels, proper support, this could be something extraordinary. Gerald walked back to his campsite and retrieved a branch he'd been eyeing for days. Oak, fallen in a storm, dried and weathered but still solid. He carried it to the hollow and began to work. The saw moved through wood with a rhythm he knew in his bones. Pull and push, steady pressure, letting the blade do the work. Sawdust fell in pale ribbons, catching the filtered sunlight. The physical act of cutting, of transforming raw material into something purposeful, steadied something in him. This was a language he spoke fluently, even after months of silence. He cut the branch into a beam roughly 7 feet long, then began the careful work of smoothing it. The chisel moved in long, controlled strokes, peeling away rough bark, revealing the pale wood beneath. Hours passed. The sun shifted, changing the angle of light through the trees. Gerald's hands moved with the kind of attention that erased everything else: worry, doubt, the phantom voices of his children's disappointment. When the beam was smooth, he carried it into the hollow and positioned it where 2 major roots created a natural arch. The fit wasn't perfect yet. He marked the spots that needed adjustment, carried the beam back out, and worked it again. Cut, test, adjust. Cut, test, adjust. The process was infinite and familiar, the kind of work that couldn't be rushed, that required presence and precision in equal measure. As he worked, his mind drifted to a summer afternoon 25 years ago. Bryce had been 10, all knees and elbows and impatient energy. Gerald had been building a bookshelf for a client, and Bryce had wanted to help. Gerald had given him a piece of scrap wood and a plane, shown him how to push it along the grain, how to let the tool do the work. Bryce had lasted maybe 15 minutes before frustration set in. "This is too slow," he'd complained. "Can't we just use the electric sander?" Gerald had knelt beside his son, taken the plane, and made one long, perfect stroke. The wood curled away in a translucent ribbon. "See that?" he'd said. "That's what patience looks like. That's what paying attention gets you. Something smooth and true." Bryce had tried again, and this time he'd gotten it. One good stroke, one perfect curl of wood. The look on his face, pride mixed with surprise, had been worth more than any commission Gerald ever earned. When had that changed? When had his patient son become an impatient lawyer who measured everything in billable hours? Or had Gerald just stopped teaching, stopped sharing what he knew, too buried in trying to save a failing business to notice his children growing into strangers? The beam finally fit perfectly. Gerald positioned it in place, wedging it between the root arch, testing its stability. It held, solid and true, bearing its own weight and offering support to the structure around it. He stepped back, looking at this first intentional addition to the hollow, this first declaration that he was building something real. He pulled out his knife and carved the date into the wood, September 24th. Not a memorial, not a marker of loss. A beginning. The sun was setting by the time he finished. Gerald built his evening fire and cooked a simple meal of rice and beans, his body pleasantly exhausted. He sat on a fallen log, looking at the hollow, with its single beam visible in the gathering darkness, and felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. Purpose. This wasn't about shelter. It wasn't even about survival, really. It was about proving something to himself that he'd forgotten in the chaos of business failure and family disappointment. He was still a craftsman. He could still take raw materials, wood, earth, stone, and transform them into something meaningful. He could still build. The forest darkened around him. An owl called from somewhere in the canopy. Gerald sat by his fire, his hands sore and satisfied, and began planning tomorrow's work. There were more beams to cut, walls to reinforce, a doorway to frame. Months of work ahead, maybe a year. He had time. He had tools. He had the hollow beneath an ancient oak, and the skills earned over 4 decades of patient craft. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. 2 months into the work, Gerald had established a rhythm as natural as breathing. He woke with the dawn, when the forest was still caught between darkness and light, that hushed moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. He'd build his fire, brew coffee in a battered tin pot, and sit watching the steam rise, while his body slowly remembered it was 61 years old. The aches were constant now, lower back, shoulders, knees, but they felt earned, honest. Not the dull throb of sitting at a desk watching invoices pile up, but the sharp clarity of physical work meeting physical limits. He'd stretch, drink his coffee, and then review his plans for the day. Always plans. Sarah used to tease him about his lists, his careful organization of even simple tasks. "You can't just do the dishes, Gerald," she'd say, laughing. "You have to plan the dishes, optimize the dishes, engineer the perfect dishwashing system." He missed that laughter more than he could say. The shelter was taking shape in increments that would have frustrated him once. Now he found peace in the slowness. Each beam had to be selected carefully from fallen wood in the forest, carried back to the hollow, measured, cut, shaped, fitted. The walls were forming where earth met root, a hybrid structure that used the oak's natural architecture as foundation. He'd learned to read the root system like a blueprint, understanding which roots bore weight, which were decorative, which needed reinforcement. The hickory mallet had been born from necessity 3 weeks into the project. He'd found the fallen tree near the stream, lightning struck but sound, its wood dense and heavy. Gerald had known immediately what it would become. He'd spent 5 days shaping it, testing the balance, adjusting the head's weight against the handle's length. When he finally drove the first stake with it, the mallet's solid thunk echoed through the forest with a satisfaction no power tool could match. Now it rarely left his side. He used it to drive support posts into the earth, to tap joints into alignment, to test the firmness of packed clay. The handle had already worn smooth where his hands gripped it, taking on the patina of use. In another few months, it would be as familiar as his own palm. Every week, Gerald made the drive into town for supplies. Millerton hadn't changed. Same storefronts, same people, same rhythms of small-town life. But Gerald moved through it differently now, head down, speaking only when necessary. He'd pay cash at the hardware store, load his truck quickly, avoid eye contact. Most people didn't recognize him anyway. The clean-shaven businessman in pressed shirts had become someone rougher, weathered, easier to overlook. Mrs. Pemberton recognized him, though. She ran the general store on Main Street, had run it for 40 years, and nothing escaped her notice. The first time Gerald came in, after moving to the forest, she'd looked at him over her reading glasses and said simply, "Coffee's fresh if you want a cup." He'd accepted, grateful for the kindness that asked no questions. They'd sat on the bench outside her store, drinking coffee in comfortable silence. Finally, she'd said, "My Albert did something similar after the factory closed. Didn't go to the woods, but he spent 2 years in the garage building a boat. Never put it in water, just built it. Sometimes a man needs to build something with his hands to remember who he is." Gerald had nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. Mrs. Pemberton had patted his arm and gone back inside, leaving him with his coffee and the first moment of being understood since he'd left town. The setback came during a storm in late October. Gerald had been reinforcing the north wall, packing clay mixed with moss between the roots to create insulation. He'd known rain was coming, had felt it in the pressure change, seen it in how the birds flew, but he'd underestimated its force. The storm hit at midnight, wind howling through the trees like something alive and angry. Rain came sideways, finding every gap in his tent, soaking his sleeping bag. Gerald had huddled in the driest corner he could find, listening to the oak groan under the wind's assault, praying the massive tree had weathered worse in its long life. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping and damaged. Gerald had crawled from his tent to find a section of the north wall collapsed. Clay and moss washed away, one of his carefully fitted beams cracked. Weeks of work undone in a single night. He'd stood there in the mud, looking at the damage, feeling something cold settle in his chest. This was foolish. He was too old, too tired, too alone. He should pack up, go back to town, find a small apartment, accept that this dream of building something meaningful was just another failure to add to the list. But then his hand had found the hickory mallet, still solid despite the storm, and something in him shifted. Failure wasn't the collapse. Failure was walking away from the collapse without trying to rebuild. He'd spent 3 days fixing the damage and improving the design. He'd cut drainage channels into the earth around the shelter, angling them to carry water away from the walls. He'd reinforced the weak points with additional supports, driven deeper into the ground with his mallet. He'd learned from the failure, adapted, built something stronger than before. That was the moment Gerald understood this project wasn't about creating a perfect shelter. It was about the process of building itself, the constant cycle of problem and solution, setback and adaptation. Every piece of wood he shaped, every joint he fitted, every wall he reinforced, these were acts of faith in his own competence, his own worth. On a cool evening in November, with the shelter walls nearly complete, Gerald sat by his fire and let his mind drift to Vanessa. She'd been 8 when she'd asked him why different woods smelled different. They'd been in his workshop, and he'd been planning a piece of cedar. The scent had filled the space, sharp and sweet. "Every tree is different," he'd told her, holding out a curl of cedar shaving. "This one smells like pencils, right? Oak smells earthy. Pine smells fresh, like Christmas. Cherry is almost fruity. The smell is in the wood itself, in the oils and resins that help the tree grow. When you cut it, you release all those years of the tree's life." Vanessa had held the shaving to her nose, breathing deep. "So we're smelling the tree's whole life?" "Something like that," Gerald had said, touched by her wonder. When had she stopped asking questions like that? When had curiosity become calculation, wonder become worry? Or maybe he'd stopped giving answers worth hearing, too tired from failing to share anything except his exhaustion. Gerald added another log to the fire and watched sparks spiral up into the darkness. Around him the shelter walls rose like ribs, defining space, creating structure. The hickory mallet rested against his knee, solid and real. His hands ached with the good pain of work well done. Tomorrow he'd start on the roof reinforcement. Next week he'd build shelving. Month by month the hollow was becoming home. And somewhere in that transformation, Gerald was becoming someone he'd almost forgotten he could be. 4 months in, Gerald woke to the first hard frost. The forest had transformed overnight, every surface glittering with ice crystals that caught the early light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. He built his fire carefully, coaxing warmth from dry kindling, and sat wrapped in his blanket, watching his breath cloud the air. Winter was coming. The shelter needed to be habitable before the deep cold arrived. That morning, he decided to explore deeper into the forest. He'd been so focused on the immediate area around the oak that he'd never ventured more than a mile in any direction. But he needed materials. Stronger wood for the door frame, stones for the hearth he was planning, maybe clay from a different source for better insulation. He packed a small bag with water and trail markers, told himself he was being practical and not procrastinating, and headed north, where the trees grew denser and older. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, muffling his footsteps. Deer trails crisscrossed the underbrush, and he followed the clearest path, watching for useful materials as he walked. 2 miles in, he found the ruins. They emerged from the forest like broken teeth, stone foundation walls, overtaken by moss and vine, the remnants of a chimney still standing despite decades of weather. A homestead, probably from the 30s or 40s, long abandoned and reclaimed by the woods. Gerald moved through the ruins carefully, respectful of whoever had tried to make a life here and ultimately failed. In what must have been the main room, he found it. A window frame incredibly still intact. The wood was weathered grey, the glass somehow unbroken despite years of neglect. Gerald knelt beside it, running his hands over the joints. Mortise and tenon, hand-cut, the work of someone who knew their craft. The frame was maybe 3 feet square, perfect size for the shelter. He examined it from every angle, testing the wood for rot. The frame was solid oak, the same species as his tree. It had been made to last, and last it had. Gerald felt a strange kinship with the unknown craftsman who'd built this window, who'd put care and skill into a home that ultimately couldn't withstand whatever forces drove them away. But the window remained. The craft remained. That mattered. Getting the frame back to his camp took most of the day. It was heavier than it looked, awkward to carry through the underbrush. He had to backtrack twice to find passable roots, and by the time he reached the oak tree, his shoulders burned and his hands were scraped raw. But he'd done it. He set the frame gently against the shelter wall and stood back, already seeing where it would go, how the light would pour through it. The next 3 days were devoted to the window. He had to cut an opening in the earthen root wall, a task requiring surgical precision to avoid damaging the root structure. He worked slowly, testing each cut, making sure he wasn't compromising the shelter's integrity. When the opening was ready, he fitted the frame into place, shimming and adjusting until it sat perfectly level. The moment he secured the last fastening and stepped back, afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating the shelter's interior for the first time. The light transformed everything. What had been a dim cave became a livable space, warm and golden. Gerald stood in that light, his eyes stinging with something that wasn't quite tears, feeling like he'd accomplished something profound. That evening he sat in the shelter with his lantern, planning shelving units. The light from outside had changed his understanding of the space. He could see possibilities he'd missed in the dimness, places for storage, areas that could be functional, corners that could be comfortable. He sketched designs in his journal, refining ideas, letting the creative part of his brain wake up after years of dormancy. This was the work he'd loved before the business consumed him. Not production, not deadlines, not profit margins. Just the pure problem-solving of craft. How to make something useful beautiful, how to let form follow function, how to respect the materials while shaping them to human need. The following week, Gerald made his regular trip to town. He was loading lumber into his truck bed outside the hardware store when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Gerald Mackenzie, that you?" He turned to find Douglas Whitmore, an old friend of Bryce's from high school. Douglas looked successful, expensive jacket, new truck, the confidence of someone whose life had gone according to plan. "Douglas, Gerald said, keeping his voice neutral. Man, I almost didn't recognize you. Bryce mentioned you were... Douglas paused, clearly uncertain how to finish that sentence. Taking some time away. Something like that. Yeah, well, tough break about the business. These things happen, though, right? My dad's hardware store went under in the 90s. He bounced back, found something else. Douglas shifted his weight, uncomfortable but determined to fill the silence. You doing okay? You need anything? Gerald recognized the tone. Pity mixed with curiosity. The kind of concern that wanted to help but also wanted to know the details, wanted the story to tell at dinner parties. Guy from high school, his dad's living in the woods now. Can you believe it? I'm fine, Gerald said. Thanks for asking. Sure. Well, if you need anything, you know. People worry. Douglas glanced at the lumber in Gerald's truck. Building something? Always, Gerald said, and climbed into his cab before Douglas could ask anything else. He drove back to the forest with his jaw clenched, angry at Douglas for the pity, angry at himself for the anger, but mostly angry at the thought of Bryce discussing him with old friends, his life reduced to cautionary tale. Did you hear about my dad? Lost everything living under a tree. It's really sad. Back at the shelter, Gerald threw himself into work with an intensity that bordered on fury. He built shelving units with hands that moved too fast, too hard, until he caught himself and forced himself to slow down. This wasn't about proving anything to Douglas or Bryce or anyone else. This was about the work itself, the craft, the quiet satisfaction of making something good. By nightfall, he'd installed 3 shelves along the south wall, each one precisely fitted between roots, level and solid. He arranged his few possessions on them, clothes, supplies, tools, and stepped back to look at what he'd created. The shelter was starting to look like a home, not a desperate man's hideout, but a chosen space, deliberately crafted, intentionally lived. He lit his lantern and sat in the rocking chair he'd salvaged from the homestead ruins, repaired and reinforced. Through the window, he could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. The forest was settling into its evening rhythms. Owl calls, distant rustling, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Gerald opened his journal, and instead of writing about the day's work, he wrote a letter he'd never send. Bryce, he wrote, I know you think I've given up. Maybe from where you're sitting it looks that way. But I want you to know something. I'm not hiding here. I'm not running. I'm building. It's what I've always done, what I should have kept doing, instead of chasing success I didn't understand. You were right that the business was dying. You were right that I should have let it go sooner. But this isn't failure. This is choosing a different kind of success, one that doesn't need anyone's approval but mine. He closed the journal without finishing the letter. The words were for himself anyway, a reminder of what he was doing here and why it mattered. Outside, an owl called again, closer this time. Gerald turned down the lantern and sat in the darkness, listening to the forest breathe around him. 6 months into the forest, winter arrived in earnest. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, turning the streams sluggish and the ground iron-hard. Gerald woke one morning to find snow falling in thick, silent flakes, transforming the forest into something from a storybook. Beautiful and potentially deadly if he wasn't prepared. He spent that day working on insulation, mixing clay from the stream bed with dried moss and pine needles, pressing the mixture into gaps between roots and beams. It was messy, cold work that left his hands raw, but he pushed through, knowing each sealed gap meant survival when the real cold hit. The ancient technique worked. By evening, the shelter held heat from his small fire in a way it never had before. The hearth became his next project. He'd been gathering riverstones for weeks, selecting them for size and shape, carrying them back in a canvas sack that grew heavier with each trip. Now he arranged them carefully at the back of the shelter, building up a fireplace structure that would vent smoke through a gap in the root system overhead. The work required patience. Each stone had to fit precisely, creating a structure that was both functional and safe. As he worked, Gerald started a new practice. Each evening, after the day's labor, he'd select a smooth stone from his collection and carve a single word into it with his knife. The first word was patience. The act of carving it, of forming each letter slowly in the stone's surface, became a meditation on the word itself. Patience with the work, patience with himself, patience with the slow healing of old wounds. The next evening, solitude, another purpose, then forgiveness, though he wasn't sure yet who needed forgiving, his children for their distance or himself for driving them away. He arranged the carved stones along a shelf, a growing collection of lessons learned in wood smoke and silence. They caught the firelight, their inscribed words creating small shadows, reminders made permanent. On the morning when the frost made every branch glitter like crystal, Gerald had a visitor. He heard footsteps approaching through the snow, too deliberate to be an animal, too unhurried to be threatening. He stepped outside to find an old man standing at the edge of the clearing, studying the shelter with intelligent eyes. The man was perhaps 70, lean and weathered, dressed in layers of wool and leather that spoke of long familiarity with the forest. He nodded to Gerald without speaking, a gesture that acknowledged presence without demanding interaction. "Coffee?" Gerald offered, surprising himself. The man considered, then nodded again. "Augustus," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Live about 3 miles northwest." They sat by Gerald's fire, drinking coffee in comfortable silence. Augustus studied the shelter the way Gerald studied wood grain, carefully, seeing things others might miss. "Good work," Augustus finally said. "Using the roots as structure, smart. Seemed wasteful to fight them. Most people would." Augustus sipped his coffee. "Most people think the forest is something to conquer. You're learning to live with it instead." They talked through the morning, or rather, Augustus talked and Gerald listened. The old man knew the forest intimately, where to find clay that wouldn't crack in winter, which trees dropped nuts when, how to read weather 3 days out from the way moss grew. He shared information casually, without the air of teaching, just one craftsman recognizing another's work. "I've been out here 12 years, Augustus said eventually. "Wife died. Kids scattered to cities. Nothing wrong with them, nothing wrong with me. We just didn't speak the same language anymore. One day I realized I was more comfortable alone than I was pretending to fit in their world." Gerald felt something loosen in his chest. "They think you gave up?" "Probably. Or that I'm crazy." Augustus shrugged. "Maybe I am. But I'm crazy on my own terms, building what I want to build, living how I want to live. That's worth something." Before he left, Augustus showed Gerald how to improve the hearth's draft, a simple adjustment that made the fire burn cleaner and warmer. "You'll make it through winter fine," he said. "But come spring you should think about a proper door. Cold's one thing. Bears waking up hungry are another." Gerald worked on weatherproofing through December, driven by both necessity and Augustus's words. He built a door frame from seasoned oak, hung a door made of planks fitted so tightly no light showed between them. He carved a simple latch, installed leather hinges, added a bar that could secure it from inside. The door swung true, closed tight, transformed the shelter from open cave to enclosed home. The ventilation system took longer. He couldn't simply seal everything. He needed airflow for the fire, for breathing, for preventing moisture buildup. He created a series of small vents near the ceiling, covered with mesh to keep insects out, positioned to create circulation without creating drafts. Engineering problems solved with hand tools and patience. By Christmas, not that he was tracking holidays anymore, the shelter was genuinely comfortable. The fire kept it warm, the insulation held that warmth, the window let in light while the door kept out wind. Gerald had even built a small table, just large enough for his coffee cup and journal. At night, with the lantern lit and the fire crackling, the space felt almost luxurious. That's when the letter arrived. Mrs. Pemberton had given it to him during his weekly supply run, her expression carefully neutral. "Came to the store," she said. "Return address says Kevin Mackenzie." Gerald had taken it with hands that weren't quite steady, shoved it in his pocket, finished his shopping, and driven back to the forest before opening it. He sat by his fire as the short winter day faded to darkness, staring at his youngest son's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a single card, an invitation to Kevin's wedding. Simple, elegant, no personal note. Just the printed details, date, time, location. 2 months away. A checkbox at the bottom for attending, not attending. Gerald set the invitation on his little table and stared at it for a long time. Kevin getting married. His boy, who used to build elaborate castles from scrapwood in the workshop. Who'd read books in the sawdust while Gerald worked. Who'd always been the gentle one, the bridge between his siblings' sharper edges. Getting married to someone Gerald had probably never met. He picked up one of his carved stones, the one that said forgiveness, and turned it over in his hands. Who needed forgiving? Kevin for moving forward with his life? Bryce and Vanessa for their distance? Or Gerald himself for being so lost in his own shame that he disappeared from their lives entirely? The wedding was in February. 2 months to decide if he was ready to face them, to walk back into a world he'd left behind, to be judged by the measure of who he used to be instead of who he was becoming. Gerald set the stone back on its shelf and added another log to the fire. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and persistent. Through his window, he watched it accumulate on branches, blanketing the forest in white silence. He didn't decide that night. But he kept the invitation, propped on his table where he'd see it every morning, a question mark hovering over every day's work. 7 months under the oak, and Gerald started the rocking chair without consciously deciding to. His hands simply reached for the right pieces of wood one morning. Maple he'd been seasoning for months, oak for the frame, a beautiful piece of walnut he'd found near the stream. He laid them out on his work area and understood what they wanted to become. This wasn't furniture for survival. This was craft for its own sake, the kind of work he'd loved before business turned creation into obligation. A rocking chair built for no one, needed by no one, justified by nothing except the desire to make something beautiful. He selected the maple for the rockers first, studying the grain until he found pieces with the right curve already suggested in the wood. The trick with rockers wasn't forcing the wood into shape. It was finding wood that wanted to bend that way, then helping it along. He soaked the pieces in the stream, weighted them under stones, let water and pressure work their slow magic. While the rockers curved, he shaped the frame. Oak for strength, joints that would hold for generations. His hands moved through patterns learned over decades, chisel and saw working in harmony. Shave, test, adjust. Cut, fit, refine. The work required total attention, left no room for worry or regret. In those hours, there was only wood and tool, and the emerging form between them. The wedding invitation still sat on his table. Every morning he looked at it, and every morning he postponed the decision. Maybe he'd go. Maybe showing up would prove something. That he wasn't broken, wasn't hiding, wasn't the failure they probably thought he was. Or maybe it would prove the opposite. Maybe he'd walk into that wedding and see in their eyes what he already knew, that he'd chosen trees over family, solitude over connection, and there was no coming back from that. Augustus visited twice more as January deepened. He'd appear without warning, share coffee and conversation, then vanish back into the woods like smoke. On his second visit, he watched Gerald working on the chair for a long time before speaking. "That's fine work," he finally said. "Who's it for?" "No one. Everyone. I don't know." Gerald set down his chisel. "Just needed to build it." Augustus nodded slowly. "I carved an entire chess set my 3rd year out here. Pawns, rooks, bishops, the whole thing. Took me 6 months. Never played a game with it. Just needed to prove I still could. Did it work?" "Proving it?" Augustus smiled, a rare expression that creased his weathered face. Yeah, it worked. But the real question wasn't whether I could do it. It was whether I could still care about doing it. That's what you're asking that chair, isn't it?" Gerald looked at the emerging form, already graceful, already right. "I'm going to Kevin's wedding," he heard himself say. "My youngest son. Getting married in 3 weeks. You decided then?" "Just now, I think." Augustus stood to leave, then paused. "I haven't seen my daughter in 8 years. She's got kids I've never met. That was my choice, my decision. But Gerald, if they're still inviting you to weddings, that door's not closed yet. Don't confuse choosing solitude with burning bridges. One gives you peace. The other just gives you regrets." After Augustus left, Gerald worked on the chair with new urgency. It became his deadline, his project, his proof. If he was going to face his children, he wanted to bring something beautiful. Not as apology. He wouldn't apologize for choosing this life, but as evidence that he wasn't just surviving in the woods. He was creating. He was still the craftsman they'd known, just working with different purposes now. The rockers emerged from the stream perfectly curved. He sanded them smooth, joined them to the frame with joints so precise they seemed to flow together. The walnut became accent pieces, armrests worn smooth, back slats carved with subtle curves that would cradle a sitter's spine. Every detail received the same attention he'd once given to commissioned pieces that fed his family. Better attention, actually. This chair wasn't constrained by someone else's vision or budget. It was pure craft, the kind of work he'd dreamed of doing before business turned dreams into spreadsheets. 2 weeks before the wedding, the chair was complete. Gerald tested it by his fire, rocking slowly, feeling the perfect balance, the smooth motion, the way every piece worked together. This was the finest thing he'd built in years, maybe ever. He imagined Kevin's face when he saw it. Would he understand what it meant? That his father hadn't given up, hadn't broken down, hadn't become less than he was? Or would he just see an expensive gift offered in place of presents, craft substituting for connection? Gerald didn't know, but he knew he had to try. The night before he left for town, he sat at his little table writing in his journal. Not about the chair or the wedding, but about what he'd learned in 7 months of forest living. How slowly good work happened. How silence revealed what noise buried. How building something with patient hands could rebuild something broken inside. He wrote about Augustus, about finding someone who understood that choosing solitude wasn't the same as running away. About Mrs. Pemberton's quiet kindness that asked nothing in return. About the carved stones on his shelf, each word a lesson learned in firelight and sawdust. He wrote about Sarah, something he hadn't let himself do in months. How she would have loved this shelter, would have seen immediately what he was trying to do. How she would have sat in this rocking chair by this fire and told him the truth he needed to hear, whatever that truth was. He missed her wisdom more than her presence, missed having someone who could see through his defenses to the fear underneath. "I'm scared," he wrote. "Scared they'll judge me. Scared they won't understand. Scared I've lost them by choosing this. But I think I had to choose this to have any chance of not losing myself. And maybe that's the thing I need them to see. That sometimes the only way forward is to step completely away from the path everyone else says you should follow." He closed the journal and began preparing for the trip. Clean clothes, trimmed beard, the chair wrapped carefully in old blankets. He'd leave before dawn, drive the 3 hours to the city, attend the wedding, face whatever came. And then, assuming they didn't throw him out, he'd extend the invitation that terrified him most. "Come see what I've built. Come see who I've become. Come understand that leaving wasn't the same as giving up." Gerald banked his fire, barred his door, and tried to sleep. Outside, an owl called across the winter darkness. Tomorrow everything would change, one way or another. Tonight, he was still just a man in a forest, a craftsman beside his craft, preparing to bridge the distance between solitude and connection. He touched the carved stone on his shelf, the one that said forgiveness, and wondered if by the end of tomorrow he'd know who that word was meant for. The vineyard where Kevin was getting married sat on rolling hills an hour outside the city, all manicured lawns and weathered barn converted to event space. Gerald arrived early, the rocking chair still wrapped in blankets in his truck bed. He sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, watching other guests arrive in their nice cars and nicer clothes, and wondered what insanity had convinced him this was a good idea. But he'd driven 3 hours. The chair was built. He was here. He carried it toward the barn, the weight familiar and comforting in his arms. A young woman with a clipboard and an earpiece stopped him at the entrance. "Sir, we're not accepting gifts here. There's a table at the—" "I need to give this directly to Kevin," Gerald said. "I'm his father." Her expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalogue. "Oh, Mr. Mackenzie, yes, Kevin mentioned, let me just wait here, please." She disappeared inside, leaving Gerald standing with the chair, feeling exposed and foolish. Other guests glanced at him curiously as they passed. An old man in clean but worn clothes, holding handmade furniture, obviously out of place in this world of pressed suits and elegant dresses. Kevin appeared in the doorway, and Gerald's breath caught. His youngest son had grown into himself in the months since they'd last seen each other. More confident somehow, settled. He wore his suit well, looked happy despite the surprise on his face. "Dad." Kevin walked forward slowly, like approaching a spooked animal. "You came." "Wasn't sure I would until this morning," Gerald admitted. "But I wanted to give you this. Made it myself." He set the chair down, unwrapped it carefully. In the afternoon sunlight, the wood glowed, maple and oak and walnut working together, every joint invisible, every curve perfect. Kevin circled it slowly, one hand trailing along the armrest, and Gerald saw the moment recognition hit. "This is incredible," Kevin breathed. "Dad, I can't believe you made this. Took me 3 weeks. Wanted you to have something that would last." Kevin looked up, eyes bright. "Can we talk?" "Before the ceremony?" "Just for a few minutes." They walked away from the barn, toward a quiet section of the vineyard where rows of dormant grapevines stretched into the distance. Gerald's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the moment of judgment, the reckoning he'd been dreading. "Bryce and Vanessa are here," Kevin said. "They're going to want to talk to you, too. But first, I need to show you something. Can you come to my apartment? It's 10 minutes from here. Now, don't you have a wedding? We have an hour before the ceremony. Please, Dad, this is important." They drove in separate cars, Gerald following Kevin's sedan through streets he didn't recognize. The apartment was small but nice, the kind of place a graduate student with modest means would call home. Kevin led him inside, through a living room with second-hand furniture and more books than shelf space, into what looked like a study. And there, on the wall, was a photograph album. Large format, expensively framed, the kind of display piece people put in prominent places. Kevin opened it carefully, and Gerald felt something shift in his chest. The photographs were old, some he recognized, and some he'd forgotten. All of them showed him teaching his children woodworking. Bryce at 10, concentrating fiercely on planing a board. Vanessa at 8, laughing as she measured a piece of maple sawdust in her hair. Kevin at 6, his small hands guided by Gerald's larger ones, learning to use a chisel. Page after page of moments Gerald had thought insignificant, forgotten in the rush of running a business. But Kevin had kept them, had treasured them enough to frame them, to display them where he'd see them every day. "I didn't know these existed," Gerald said quietly. "Yeah, Mom took most of them." "She knew." Kevin touched one photograph gently. "These are my favorite memories, Dad. Not the business dinners or the awards ceremonies or any of that success stuff. These, learning to make things with you, you never said." "I know. I should have." Kevin closed the album. "After you built the business up, after you started winning commissions and hiring employees, you stopped teaching us. Started pushing us toward practical careers instead. Bryce went to law school because you said business needed legal protection. Vanessa went into marketing because you needed help with branding. I went into literature because it was the only thing far enough away that you couldn't make it about the workshop." Gerald sat heavily on Kevin's couch, the weight of this revelation crushing. "I didn't realize." "I know you didn't. None of us told you. We thought we were helping, being practical, supporting the business. But what we really wanted was what's in those pictures. To keep learning from you. To make things with our hands the way you taught us. Then why did you all pull away when everything fell apart?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment. "Guilt," he finally said. "We felt guilty that we couldn't help, that we'd chosen these careers that couldn't fix what was broken. Bryce offered legal advice you couldn't afford to follow. Vanessa created marketing that couldn't save a dying market. I was studying poetry while you lost everything. We didn't know how to face you with our useless education and empty hands." Something unlocked in Gerald's chest. Something that had been clenched tight for years. "You thought I blamed you, didn't you?" "No." The word came out fierce, certain. "I blame myself for building something on a foundation I didn't understand. for choosing success over craft, growth over quality, for teaching you that what mattered was the business, not the work. They sat in silence, the truth settling between them like dust after a storm. Outside, afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating those photographs of a younger Gerald, teaching younger children the only thing he'd ever really known how to do. "Where are you living, Dad?" Kevin asked finally. "Really living, I mean. In the forest. Built a shelter under an oak tree. It's—" Gerald stopped, unsure how to explain. "It's good, simple, honest work. Can we see it? Me and—" Kevin hesitated. "And Bryce and Vanessa? Would you let us visit?" Gerald looked at his son, saw genuine curiosity there, not pity. Saw the child who'd loved working with wood, grown into a man who still valued those memories enough to frame them. "Yes," he said. "Yes, you can visit." They drove back to the vineyard, and this time when Gerald walked into the barn, Bryce and Vanessa were waiting. The conversations that followed were awkward, halting, years of misunderstanding trying to untangle themselves in stolen minutes before a wedding ceremony. But threads began to connect. Questions led to answers, led to more questions. By the time Kevin walked down the aisle, something had shifted. Gerald sat in the back row, watching his youngest son marry a woman he'd just met, and felt the first fragile bridge extending across the distance he'd created. After the ceremony, during the reception, all three of his children approached him together. Vanessa touched the rocking chair with reverent hands. Bryce examined its joinery with his lawyer's precise attention to detail. And Kevin just smiled. "We want to visit," Vanessa said. "Really visit? See what you've built?" Gerald nodded, not trusting his voice. He gave them directions to the oak tree, told them to come whenever they were ready. He drove back to the forest as evening fell, his truck empty of the chair, but somehow feeling lighter. The revelation kept circling his mind. They hadn't been ashamed. They'd been guilty. All this time, they'd carried their own weight of failure, their own sense of having disappointed him. He'd left to escape their judgment, only to discover the judgment was mutual, the disappointment shared, the distance created by pride and misunderstanding on both sides. Gerald arrived at his shelter after dark, built up his fire, and sat in the space he'd created. Tomorrow they would come. His children would see what he'd built from nothing, would understand that leaving hadn't been surrender. And maybe, just maybe, they'd see what he was only beginning to understand himself. That the only thing he'd ever needed to prove was that he could still build something beautiful. Not for profit or reputation or anyone else's approval. Just because that's what craftsmen do. 2 weeks after the wedding, Gerald received a text from Kevin. "All three of us want to visit. Next Saturday, okay?" Gerald stared at his phone, a basic flip model he kept charged for emergencies, and felt his stomach tighten. Saturday, 5 days away. 5 days to prepare for his children to see exactly how he'd been living, to judge whether this forest life was dignified independence or pathetic retreat. He looked around the shelter with fresh eyes, trying to see it as they would. The packed earth floor, the root-woven walls, the salvaged window letting in morning light. Was it impressive or sad? Evidence of resourcefulness or proof of decline? Then he stopped himself. This wasn't about impressing them. It was about showing them the truth. And the truth was that this shelter, this life, had saved him in ways they might never understand. But there was something he wanted to build first. The idea came fully formed, a table. Not just any table, but one large enough for 4, solid enough to gather around, beautiful enough to show what he could still create. A family table built with the hope that someday they might actually be a family again. Gerald spent that afternoon selecting wood. Oak for the top, 3 boards he'd been seasoning for months, their grain patterns complementary. Maple for the legs, strong and stable. He carried the pieces back to his work area and began the slow process of joining them. The table took shape over 4 days. He worked from first light until dark, hands moving through patterns older than thought. Plane the boards perfectly flat. Match the grain so the seams would be invisible. Cut mortise and tenon joints that would hold for generations. Sand everything smooth as glass. But it was the chairs that consumed him. 4 chairs, each one different, each one made with a specific person in mind. Bryce's chair, straight lines, precise angles, no unnecessary decoration. Strong, dependable, built to support weight without complaint. The chair of someone who valued structure and certainty. Vanessa's chair, curved back, elegant proportions, carved details that rewarded close attention. Beautiful and functional in equal measure. The chair of someone who understood that aesthetics and utility weren't enemies. Kevin's chair, simple comfort, gentle curves, perfect for long hours of sitting and thinking. Solid but not heavy, welcoming without demanding attention. The chair of someone who valued substance over appearance. His own chair, weathered but unbroken, showing marks of use and repair, bearing the weight of years with quiet dignity. The chair of someone who'd learned that scars didn't mean failure. Augustus appeared on the third day, watched Gerald working on the chairs, and said nothing for a long while. "You're preparing for something," he finally observed. "My children. They're coming Saturday." "Ah." Augustus accepted coffee, sat on a stump. "And you're building a table to prove you're not crazy, to prove I'm not broken. Gerald, they're coming to see you, not judge your furniture." Augustus sipped his coffee. "Though that table's going to be beautiful. The chairs, too. What if they still don't understand? What if they look at all this and just see—" Gerald gestured around the clearing, unable to finish. "Then they're not looking at what matters." Augustus set down his cup. "I told you about my daughter. 8 years no contact. That was my choice. I accepted it. But your kids are driving out here to see you. That means something. Don't sabotage it by needing them to be impressed. Just let them see who you are now." After Augustus left, Gerald finished the chairs and assembled the table. He positioned it near the window where afternoon light would fall across it warmly. The 4 chairs arranged around it looked like an invitation, or maybe a hope. Friday evening, the night before they arrived, Gerald prepared the shelter. Not cleaning for inspection. The space was always clean. That was part of how he lived now, but arranging it to tell its story. The carved stones on their shelf, each word visible. The hickory mallet resting by the door. The tools hung carefully on the wall. The window frame from the abandoned homestead. Everything he'd built or found or learned, displayed not as achievement, but as evidence of a life deliberately chosen. He gathered provisions for the next day. Wild mushrooms he'd learned to identify, herbs from the forest floor, fresh water from the stream. He'd make them a simple meal, show them how he lived, let them understand that this wasn't deprivation. It was clarity. That night, he sat at the new table, his hands resting on wood still slightly warm from the friction of final sanding. He thought about Sarah, about what she'd say if she could see him now. Probably something about how it took losing everything for him to remember what mattered. She'd always been able to see through his complications to the simple truth underneath. "They love you, Gerald," she'd said in one of their last conversations, when the cancer was winning and time was running out. "They just don't know how to show it, and you don't know how to let them. Maybe tomorrow would be the beginning of learning. Not how to be the father he'd been, successful businessman, workshop owner, provider of practical direction, but how to be the father he should have been all along. The craftsman who understood that the best thing he could teach them wasn't how to succeed, but how to build something meaningful with patient hands and honest work. He touched each chair in turn, feeling their solidity, their rightness. Then he walked outside to check the weather. Clear sky, cold stars, the promise of a good day tomorrow. In the darkness he heard an owl call. Somewhere deeper in the forest, Augustus was probably sitting by his own fire, living his own chosen solitude. Mrs. Pemberton was closing up her store in town, going home to her own evening rituals. The world continued its patterns, indifferent to one man's anxiety about whether his children would understand the life he'd built. Gerald added another log to his fire and watched sparks rise into the night. Tomorrow his children would drive down that old logging road, would walk into this clearing, would see with their own eyes what he'd become. And whatever happened after that, judgment or understanding, connection or continued distance, he would face it knowing he'd built something true. The table was ready. The chairs were ready. The shelter told its story. All that remained was to see if anyone was willing to listen. Gerald heard the vehicles before he saw them, 2 cars making their way slowly down the rutted logging road. He stood by the fire, coffee cup in hand, trying to keep his breathing steady. This was it. No more wondering, no more preparing. His children were here. Bryce's sedan appeared first, followed by Vanessa's compact SUV. They parked at the clearing's edge and climbed out slowly, taking in the forest, the massive oak, the shelter barely visible beneath its roots. Gerald watched them process what they were seeing, saw the surprise on their faces. Kevin approached first, his expression open with curiosity. "Dad, this is wow. It's different," Gerald said, keeping his voice level. Come see." They followed him toward the shelter, and he watched their faces as they got closer, as the structure revealed itself. What had looked like a natural formation from a distance became clearly human-made up close. The fitted beams, the mortared stones, the carefully integrated root system. Vanessa reached out to touch one of the carved support posts. "You built this? All of this? Every piece. Took 7 months so far. Still adding to it." Bryce walked around the perimeter, his lawyer's mind assessing structure and stability. Gerald could almost see him cataloging details, forming judgments. Then Bryce crouched to examine where a beam joined a root, and his expression shifted. "Dad, this joinery. This is museum-quality work. It's just what I know how to do." "No," Bryce stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "This is what you used to do before the business got too big. Before production schedules and profit margins. This is you." Gerald felt something catch in his throat. He gestured toward the entrance. "Come inside." They ducked through the doorway one by one, and Gerald heard their collective intake of breath. The afternoon light streamed through the salvage window, illuminating the interior. The table sat in that light, the 4 chairs arranged around it, everything glowing warm and golden. Kevin moved to the rocking chair Gerald had given him at the wedding. Gerald had retrieved it that morning, brought it here for this moment. Kevin sat carefully, began to rock and smiled. "It's perfect. Even better here than I imagined." Vanessa circled the new table, her fingers trailing along its surface. "This grain pattern. Dad, how did you match these boards so perfectly?" "Patience," Gerald said. "And attention. Things I forgot I had." She looked up at him, eyes bright. "This is incredible, all of it. The shelter, the furniture, the—" She gestured around the space. "I thought you'd be camping, living rough, but this is home," Gerald finished. "It's home." Bryce had moved to the wall where Gerald's tools hung in careful arrangement. He reached toward them, stopped just short of touching. "These are your old hand tools. The ones from when I was a kid. The ones I should have kept using." They explored the space in silence for a while, taking in details. The carved stones on their shelf, each word catching light. The hearth, built from river rocks. The shelving units fitted between roots. The door that closed true. The ventilation system, the clay and moss insulation. Every element telling the story of careful thought and patient work. Gerald showed them how the root system formed natural archways overhead, how he'd worked with the tree's structure instead of against it. He explained the drainage channels that carried water away from the walls, the insulation technique he'd learned from trial and error, the window frame salvaged from ruins 2 miles north. "You learned all this yourself?" Kevin asked, running his hand along a perfectly fitted joint. "Some from Augustus, a man who lives deeper in the forest. Some from books, most from paying attention and being willing to fail." Gerald touched one of his early beams, where the saw marks were less precise. "This was my 3rd attempt at that cut. First 2 I got wrong." Vanessa studied the carved stones on the shelf, reading each word silently. "You made these?" "One each evening. Carving the word became a way of understanding it. Patience, solitude, purpose." He picked up the one marked forgiveness, turned it in his hands. "This one took me 3 nights to finish. Kept starting over because I wasn't sure who I needed to forgive." "And now?" Bryce asked quietly. "Everyone, myself most of all." Finally, they gathered at the table. Gerald served them soup he'd made that morning from wild mushrooms and herbs, bread he'd baked in a Dutch oven over coals. Simple food that tasted like the forest, like paying attention to seasons and what the land offered. They ate in awkward silence, spoons against wooden bowls, everyone waiting for someone else to start the conversation that needed to happen. Bryce finally spoke. "Why did you really leave, Dad? And I don't mean the business failing. I mean why here? Why this?" Gerald set down his spoon, looked at each of his children in turn. "Because I was ashamed. Because I'd spent 40 years building something I thought mattered, and it crumbled. Because every time I looked at you three, all I could see was my own failure reflected back. The opportunities I couldn't give you anymore. The respect I'd lost. The father you deserved but didn't have. We never thought," Vanessa started. "I know. Kevin showed me the photographs. Explained about the guilt." Gerald took a breath. "But I needed you to understand something. I didn't come here to give up. I came here to remember who I was before I lost myself in business and success and all those things that felt important but weren't." He reached across the table and picked up one of his carved stones, the one that read, "Forgiveness." He turned it in his hands, feeling its weight. "I kept these tools," he said, gesturing to the wall. "Your mother gave me that chisel set on our 10th anniversary. Said a craftsman was only as good as his tools and his patience. After she died, I forgot the patience part. Forgot that the work itself was supposed to matter more than what the work produced." Kevin leaned forward. "Is that what this place is?" Remembering. "It's that. But it's also," Gerald struggled for words, "it's proof that I can still build something beautiful. That failure doesn't erase skill. That starting over doesn't mean starting less." The light through the window shifted, grew longer and more golden. Gerald stood and walked to his makeshift dresser, pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside were 3 small wooden boxes, each one crafted with the same care he'd put into everything else in this shelter. He carried them back to the table and set them down, one before each child. "Open them." They did, slowly, and Gerald watched recognition dawn on their faces. Inside each box was a complete set of woodworking tools, the first tools he'd ever given them, sized for children's hands, worn from use but carefully maintained all these years. "I kept your first tool sets," Gerald said. "Bryce, yours from when you were 10. Vanessa, yours from when you were 8. Kevin, you got yours at 6. Been carrying them with me all this time. Couldn't let them go." Bryce lifted out a small plane, his fingers remembering its weight despite decades since he'd held it. "I learned to shave wood with this. Spent a whole afternoon making one perfect curl. You were so proud of that curl," Gerald said. "Your mother framed it. Hung it in the kitchen." Vanessa picked up her smallest chisel, tested its edge, still sharp because Gerald had maintained them, still functional because he'd believed someday they might be used again. "I carved my name into a piece of oak with this. Took me 3 hours because I wanted every letter perfect." "I still have that piece," Gerald admitted. "In my truck?" "Have all 3 of your first projects." Kevin just stared at his tools, his eyes wet. "You kept everything. Even when you lost everything else, you kept these." "I kept what mattered," Gerald said simply. "Took me a while to understand the difference between what I valued and what actually had value. But I got there." Gerald moved to the shelf, where he kept his most precious possessions. Among the carved stones and essential supplies sat a wooden box he'd built years ago, its surface darkened with age and handling. He brought it to the table and set it down carefully as if it might shatter. "There's more," he said quietly. "Things I need you to see." He opened the box slowly. Inside were treasures his children had probably assumed were lost, items they'd created as kids, gifts they'd given him, moments preserved in physical form. Vanessa's first drawing of a horse, done in crayon when she was 6, the paper yellowed, but the image still vibrant. Kevin's acceptance letter to graduate school, creased from being carried in Gerald's wallet for months. Bryce's Little League trophy, from the year his team came in dead last, but celebrated anyway. The plastic figure still golden despite the passage of time. There were other things too. A Mother's Day card Vanessa had made, covered in glitter and misspellings. A book report Kevin had written in 4th grade about a story where a boy learned carpentry from his grandfather. A photograph of Bryce at his law school graduation, serious and proud, standing next to Gerald in a moment neither of them had known would become precious. "We thought you threw all this away," Vanessa whispered, touching her drawing with one finger. When you downsized the workshop when everything got sold, we thought you kept the business records and got rid of everything personal. I got rid of the business records, Gerald said. Burned them actually in a bonfire the night before I left town. But these, he touched the edge of the box, I carried your whole lives with me. Always. Even when I thought I'd lost you. Kevin picked up his acceptance letter, unfolded it carefully. You kept this? I figured after I chose literature instead of something practical, something that could have helped save the business. I was proud of you. Gerald interrupted. So proud. You chose something you loved, something that fed your soul. I just didn't know how to tell you that, without making it sound like I was disappointed you weren't choosing business or law or something more practical. He sat back down heavily, looking at each of them in turn. Your mother knew what was happening, saw it clearly even when I couldn't. She told me near the end that I was teaching you the wrong lessons, that I was showing you how to succeed in business, but forgetting to show you how to succeed at being human. Bryce's voice was rough when he spoke. We thought we disappointed you, that we couldn't save the business because we'd chosen the wrong paths. I became a lawyer thinking I could help with contracts and legal issues. Vanessa went into marketing, thinking she could help with branding and outreach. But by the time we had those skills, it was too late. You disappointed no one, Gerald said firmly. The business was dying because I'd lost sight of what made it good in the first place. I started chasing growth instead of quality, started taking commissions I didn't care about just to keep the money flowing. I built an empire on a foundation of craft, then forgot about the craft and wondered why the empire crumbled. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with years of misunderstanding finally finding words. Outside, the forest continued its eternal rhythms. Bird calls, wind through branches, the creek running over stones. Inside the shelter, 4 people sat in lantern glow, truth settling between them like dust after a storm. Are you happy here, Dad? Kevin asked quietly. Really, truly happy? Not just surviving or hiding, but actually happy? Gerald considered the question, gave it the weight it deserved. He looked around the shelter, at the walls he'd built, the table he'd crafted, the window that let in light, the hearth that provided warmth. He thought about his morning rituals, the satisfaction of work done well, the peace of falling asleep to forest sounds instead of worries about invoices and overhead. For the first time since your mother died, yes, he said. I wake up knowing exactly what I'm supposed to do. Build, maintain, improve, create. No spreadsheets, no client demands, no pretending to be something I'm not. Just craft for craft's sake. Just work that matters because I say it matters, not because someone's paying me or judging the results. Vanessa's eyes were wet. I quit my job last month. The marketing position I thought would make you proud. It felt meaningless. Every campaign, every strategy session, I kept thinking about those afternoons in your workshop, carving little wooden horses. How alive I felt doing that. How much it mattered to get the curve of the neck just right, even though no one but me would ever notice. I noticed, Gerald said. You had a gift for seeing what the wood wanted to become. Still do, probably, if you'd give yourself permission to remember. I'm terrified of failing, Bryce admitted suddenly, the words coming out like a confession. Every case, every brief, I'm haunted by the thought that I'll end up like... He stopped himself, but the unspoken words hung there anyway. Like me, Gerald finished gently. Bryce, I didn't fail because I tried and fell short. I failed because I stopped doing what I was good at and started chasing what other people said success should look like. There's a difference, a big one. What's the difference? One teaches you something. The other just hurts. Gerald picked up his carved stone again, the one marked forgiveness. Failure isn't falling down. It's refusing to build something new from the pieces. It's letting shame keep you on the ground instead of using it as foundation. Kevin set down his acceptance letter carefully, smoothing its creases. I'm struggling, Dad. The academic pressure, the publish or perish mentality, the constant feeling that I'm not doing enough. Not being enough, I don't know if this is my path, or if I just chose it because it was far enough from the workshop that you couldn't make it about furniture or business or practical applications. The confession struck Gerald hard. Like a physical blow. I did that to you. Made you run so far from craft that you forgot you loved it. Made all of you feel like working with your hands was somehow less valuable than working with your minds. Maybe, Kevin said. Or maybe we just need to remember what we loved before we learn to be ashamed of it. Which is why he looked at his siblings, some unspoken agreement passing between them. We were hoping you'd teach us again. Really teach us. Not as kids who needed supervision this time, but as adults who understand what we gave up when we walked away from craft. Gerald felt his throat tighten. Teach you? Woodworking, Vanessa said. The right way. The patient way. The way that makes something beautiful just because beautiful things matter. Not because they're profitable or impressive or likely to succeed in a marketplace. I could come out on weekends, Bryce offered. And Gerald heard hope in his voice, fragile and tentative. Take a break from cases and briefs and the constant pressure to bill more hours. Learn this, he gestured around the shelter. Whatever this is. Whatever you found here that makes you look more at peace than I've seen you in 20 years. Gerald looked at the table he'd built, at the 4 chairs arranged around it, at the hearth where 4 stones would soon rest together. This table has 4 chairs for a reason, he said, his voice unsteady. You're always welcome here. Not to live in the forest, though you could if you wanted, but to remember what matters. To build something with your hands. To learn that the value of work isn't measured in profit or prestige or what other people think of it. They sat together as evening deepened, talking in ways they hadn't talked in years. Honest words about fear and guilt and the weight of expectations they'd all carried like stones in their pockets. Vanessa admitted she'd felt invisible in her marketing job, just another cog producing content that disappeared into the digital void. Bryce confessed that winning cases felt hollow, that he'd started each day by asking what it was all for and ending each day with no good answer. Kevin revealed he was seriously considering leaving his program, starting over, finding work that fed his soul instead of just padding his resume. Gerald listened, really listened, and understood that his children weren't asking for solutions or advice or the kind of parental wisdom that came wrapped in certainty. They were asking for permission to value something other than success, permission to fail and rebuild, permission to choose craft over career, if that's what made them whole. Your mother would say, I finally learned the lesson, Gerald said, as full darkness fell outside the window, that the point of building things isn't to prove you're not broken. It's to understand that being broken and being worthless aren't the same thing. That you can be damaged and still create beauty. That starting over isn't admission of defeat, it's evidence of courage. Before they left for the night, to sleep in their vehicles and tent under stars they never saw in the city, Gerald taught them his hearth ritual. Each person selected a smooth stone from his collection by the stream, held it, felt its weight and texture. Then by firelight and lantern glow, they carved a single word into its surface, with knife and time and attention. The work was slow, meditative. The scratch of blade on stone created a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. No one spoke. They just carved, patient and focused, learning through their hands what Gerald had been learning for 7 months, that meaningful work couldn't be rushed. That attention was its own reward, that creating something permanent required surrendering to the pace the work demanded. When they finished, they held up their stones in the firelight. Bryce had carved, belonging. Vanessa had carved, belonging. Kevin had carved, belonging. Gerald stared at the 3 words, identical without planning or discussion, and felt something crack open in his chest. With shaking hands, he picked up his own blank stone and carved the same word, his knife following patterns his children had unknowingly chosen first. Together, they placed the 4 stones in the hearth, arranging them so each touched the others, a permanent installation, a promise carved in river rock and firelight, and the shared understanding that family didn't require perfection, just presence, honesty, and the willingness to keep building even after everything fell apart. Family reformed, not fixed. They'd each carry their damage forward, each face their own struggles and doubts. but reconnected in ways that mattered more than success or failure, more than careers or achievements, more than any measure of worth the world might offer. They belonged to each other again, and that was enough. Morning came soft and gold, filtering through the salvaged window to wake Gerald in increments. His children had stayed the night, Bryce in his truck bed with a sleeping bag, Vanessa and Kevin in a tent they'd brought. The sight of their vehicles still parked at the clearing's edge filled Gerald with something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or hope. He built the fire up and started coffee, the familiar morning ritual made new by the presence of others. One by one, they emerged, rumpled, stiff from sleeping rough, but smiling in a way that suggested they'd crossed some threshold in the night and found the other side worth reaching. "Teach us something," Vanessa said over coffee. "Before we have to leave." "Something real," Gerald considered, then nodded. "Fire starting. The right way. Not just lighting a match, but understanding what fire needs and how to give it. He showed them how to select kindling, the difference between pine that caught quick and oak that burned slow. How to arrange it so air could flow but heat could build. How to feed a flame without smothering it, patience over force. They practiced, making small fires in the clearing, learning to read smoke and heat and the language of combustion. Bryce struggled at first, too heavy-handed, trying to force results. Then something shifted and he slowed down, paid attention, let the fire teach him its rhythms. When his kindling finally caught and held, his expression was pure childhood joy. "I forgot how good this feels," he said, "making something work through attention instead of just pushing." After fire came wood. Gerald showed them how to read grain, how to understand which pieces wanted to split and which would hold. He gave them each a branch and his hickory mallet, taught them to drive a wedge with control instead of strength. Kevin took to it naturally, finding the rhythm. Vanessa carved notches with the focus she probably brought to marketing campaigns, but had never found satisfying. "This is what I needed," she said, running her thumb along the smooth wood she'd shaped. "To make something that doesn't need analytics or approval, just my hands and attention and time." As afternoon arrived, they prepared to leave. But the leaving felt different now. Not departure, but pause, the space between visits rather than the space between strangers. "We want to come back," Kevin said. "All of us. Regular visits. Learn from you the way we should have been learning all along." "Thanksgiving," Bryce suggested. "Out here. All four of us. If you'll have us." Gerald looked at the table where they'd shared meals, at the chairs built for each of them, at the hearthstones carved with their shared word. "I'll have you, always." Vanessa hugged him, fierce and long. "I need to learn this, Dad, really learn it. Not as hobby, but as—" She struggled for words. "As a way of being in the world that makes sense." "Then I'll teach you," Gerald promised. "Every weekend you can spare? We'll start with something simple. A box, maybe, and work up to furniture. Take as long as it takes." Bryce was next, his hug awkward but genuine. "I'm bringing case files when I come back. Not to work on them. To use as kindling." He smiled, something lighter in his expression than Gerald had seen in years. "I need your advice on life decisions, not legal ones. On what matters when nothing's at stake except being honest with yourself." Kevin's embrace lasted longest. "Thank you for showing us this. For not pretending you had it all figured out. For letting us see that rebuilding yourself is possible, even when everything falls apart. Thank you for coming," Gerald said. "For not writing me off as crazy or lost. For seeing what I built instead of what I left behind." They drove away slowly, dust rising behind their vehicles, and Gerald stood watching until they disappeared down the logging road. Then he returned to his shelter, sat at the table, touched each chair in turn. The space felt different now, not empty despite being alone, full somehow, full of possibility and promise and the echo of honest conversation. He started a new project that afternoon, a small table, simple but sturdy, made from oak and care. For Augustus, who'd shown him that chosen solitude wasn't the same as loneliness, who'd given wisdom without judgment when Gerald needed it most. As he worked, Gerald thought about the journey that had brought him here. The business collapse that felt like the end, but was really just transition. The shame that drove him to the forest. The slow discovery that building something beautiful could rebuild something broken. His hands moved through familiar patterns, measure, cut, shape, fit. The work that had once felt like obligation now felt like meditation. Each stroke of the plane, each tap of the mallet, each careful joining of wood to wood, these weren't just tasks. They were choices, conscious decisions to make something good exist in the world. The afternoons stretched long and gentle. Birds called from the canopy. The creek ran its eternal course. The massive oak stood as it had stood for centuries, roots and branches defining space, providing shelter, bearing witness to one man's decision to stop running and start building. Gerald finished the small table as the sun set, and he ran his hand across its surface, smooth, true, solid. Tomorrow he'd take it to Augustus, a gift that said what words couldn't about gratitude and understanding, and the value of someone seeing you clearly without requiring you to explain yourself. But tonight, he sat in his shelter with lantern light warming the walls, looking at the 4 hearthstones that spelled belonging 4 times over. His children would return. They'd learn and grow and maybe find their own versions of what Gerald had found. That the value of work wasn't measured in money or status, but in the honest attention brought to it. Sometimes the people who love us most are the first ones to stop believing in us, Gerald thought, remembering where this had all started. But sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you build something true enough, they find their way back to belief. Not belief in who you were, belief in who you're becoming. Gerald banked his fire, checked his door, touched the carved word on his own hearthstone, belonging, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones. He belonged here, to this forest, this craft, this life built slowly with patient hands and honest work. And now, finally, he belonged to his family again, not as provider or success story or cautionary tale, but as father, as teacher, as man still learning, still building, still becoming. The forest breathed around him, eternal and accepting. Gerald closed his eyes and listened to it, grateful for everything that had broken and everything that had been built from the breaking. This was home. This was peace. This was enough. It was everything